forensics. Just a quick overview on how mobile forensics slightly varies from the other types of forensics that we looked at previously, especially to do with the Faraday bag / cage. So that hopefully was a useful slide. Just in the interest of time, I know we have a few more topics to cover within the next hour and a half, so I will fly through the remaining remaining types of forensics techniques. First one is malware forensics for, well, again, malware, any types of virus, Trojan, worm, what have you. These are primarily analyzed through reverse engineering, which means you set up a sandbox, which is
Sriram, can you make it full screen mode?
I think this is in full screen. Give me just a second. Presenter view. Is it full screen now, sir?
No, actually.
That's weird. This is what I did last time.
I think the complete.
Okay, give me just a second. Let me try something.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Right. So going back to malware forensics, the way you do it is you reverse engineer it. Means you see how it works and then look at the logic and then work your way backwards to determine what it's actually supposed to do. And that way you'd also be able to find out which systems, which files, which directories this malware had actually accessed, and potentially if it exfiltrated data, or what exactly it did. Did it delete data? Did it send data outside? Did it encrypt data? All that good stuff. So you set up an isolated VM. VM is a virtual machine. So you set up a sandbox, which is basically a self-contained environment which has no access to any of your other systems in your network, so that even if you let this malware run rampant, your other systems are safe. You let the malware do its thing, see if you can get an understanding of what is happening with your system. And like I mentioned previously, this would give you a good idea of what exactly this malware was designed for and what kind of application logic it uses. It could also give you an idea of what kind of encryption it uses. I remember I had to do an assessment during my master's where we had to determine what kind of encryption methodology it was using. And we had to reverse engineer it and basically walk through the code one by one to determine the type of encryption it used. For anybody who is a fan of the microprocessor module from second year in computer engineering, congratulations. This actually heavily relies on assembly language, which is the only way to actually do reverse engineering for malware. So you'd actually be using a tool called IDA, which would basically show you a visual representation and a graphical representation of the different modules that this malware uses. And you would be able to walk through manually every step of the code and see where exactly or how exactly the application logic works. And using that, you'd be able to determine what the application does, what its primary function is, what its secondary function, if anything, if at all, is there, what exactly is it, and you'd also be able to determine if you'd be able to decrypt any files if you were able to determine the encryption methodology that it uses. So that's a quick overview of malware forensics. Email forensics, I think I mentioned this previously. This would be one of the more straightforward ones. Basically, any cybercrime or incident that was caused, or a cyber incident that was caused by using any mail services, you would use email forensics to investigate that and find out the root cause and I guess supplementary information. As you all know, mail servers, they usually contain a copy of every email sent and received within an organization. Usually organizations would have a centralized mail server. any organization that uses a common service like Gmail, Yahoo, Outlook. Obviously, when it comes to this, it's a little more complex because you would need to reach out to these organizations to try and see if you can get that information from them. But if you're a large enough organization where you manage your own mail servers, if you have your own domain set up, then obviously it's a lot easier because you would have direct access to your mail server, and you'll be able to get information as much as you want from these servers. And when it comes to email forensics, there's two parts, right? So one is the client side, which is your desktop, and the actual client, your Outlook client or your Thunderbird client that you use to send the emails. And then there's the server itself, which is the mail server that I mentioned previously. So on the client side, the primary evidence that you can gather is from email headers. So any email that you send or receive that would usually have an email or a header attached to it. You'd be able to see this even now if you go into your Gmail or Yahoo or whichever service that you use. If you click on, I think, message info, it should be one of the options that's on the, I think, burger icon and the three dots. If you click on that, you should be able to see a lot more information. Basically, who the sender was, who the receiver was, what date, what time, and it's not just time as in, oh, it's 9:45. No, it would be the exact hour, minute, second, potentially millisecond as well, if I remember right. So it'd be very precise information, and the most important piece would be the message ID. Message ID means it's unique to each message. It is very rare that it's duplicated. So that is also something that would be crucial for your investigation. Using that, you'd be able to build a case against or for whichever investigation that you are carrying out. And obviously, there's the last point in that, which is identification of the email software, or I guess web server that was used. My bad, that's actually a typo on my end. Using the Xmailer or user agent fields, it would usually say what kind of service was used. Obviously, if it's your own service, so if you have your own domain, you would find out that it's using your actual domain and your actual software. But if it's an attacker who has sent you an email with, let's say, a ransomware attachment, then you could start investigating that because the primary delivery method would be an email. You could start investigating that email. You could find out who sent it. Obviously, they would more than likely use a non-standard service provider, so some fake email generator of sorts, where they would create you a small domain. You'd be able to register a user and then send spam emails to batch recipients. You'd be able to find out who that provider is, reach out to them, and more than likely they will cooperate with the investigator, because the alternative would be them shutting down until you get the information that you need, which would mean loss of business for them. So even though they are providing a service which is grossly misused, they will still cooperate with you because the alternative is they run out of business. So that's just a quick overview on email forensics. Obviously, email forensics, it's a slightly larger topic, because a lot of the times email is the primary means of delivery for malware, and obviously there have been a few cases where ransomware was delivered through email. People click on the files, ends up encrypting everything. But the primary delivery method would be email. So this is a good starting point. And then after that, it leads into disk forensics. It leads into network forensics. So that's why I haven't really gone too much into detail here. Finally, memory forensics. It's more focused towards volatile memory, which is your RAM, your system memory. And the reason it's called volatile is because the moment you switch off your system, all data in your RAM is wiped, which is not really something that a forensic investigator would want. The forensic investigator would want all the data that's on the actual RAM at the time that they are investigating. So what memory forensics aims to do is to capture a point in time copy of the memory, copy of contents of the memory. And the reason I say point in time is because, as I mentioned before, again, I go back to those two key points. Any action that you do on the system will introduce a change to the memory. So if you need to do a memory dump, then you may need to move your mouse, you may need to hit a few keys that will all obviously alter the content of the memory. And obviously that would be slightly different to what you were hoping to get. So whatever memory dump that you take, it would be a point in time memory dump of your memory. Because of the changing nature of volatile memory or RAM, usually people take multiple dumps, and a lot of the times you would see this in servers, where, like I said before, you might have multiple tenants, and it may not necessarily be possible to stop a server entirely. Obviously, if they have the service properly load balanced, they would have a couple of servers which is delivering the service. So even if they take one server out, they should have 4 other servers that are running in the background providing that service. But that may not necessarily be the case, especially with smaller organizations or like 4 or 5 people organization, where this kind of load balancing or having redundant servers isn't really something that they can afford. So in those cases, you may need to take multiple dumps of the RAM, investigate it, and then collate all of your findings into a single data source, not data source, a data sheet. And then obviously you would specify which data dump you got that specific information from. So when you, at the end of your investigation, present it to your prosecution or to the judge, they would know exactly where this information is from, because you can't just give them one piece of information and go, I took this from a server, because the next immediate question would be, how can you tell that this data is valid because you did not take the server offline? And that would cause a whole bunch of follow-up questions to come up, which will eventually lead to the case potentially being thrown out. So just one more point I figured I'd call out here for the memory forensics is the multiple memory dumps and the way they are handled. And so that's all for forensic technology. Hopefully that made sense. Let me see if I can give me just a second. Okay. If you have any questions, do let me know. I'll move on with the next section. And just to give you a heads up, I'll be jumping between this topic and this topic, because I feel they are very closely related, because understanding computer investigation and an actual processing a crime and incident scene is very interlinked. So I want to cover both of them side by side, or I guess interlinked is the way to describe it. So if I jump around a bit, my apologies, but that's the reason why. To start off, what is a computer investigation? Investigating a crime that was carried out using a computer and a network. So that is the official definition, by the way. Wikipedia said so. But as you've seen just now, over the past hour and a half, that single line is a very, very generalized statement of computer investigation. Because of the advancement of technologies and the different cybercrime methodologies and the growing forensic techniques and technologies, you can't just say it's carried out using a computer and a network. You could say it is a computer system, which would encompass a lot of the technologies, and obviously a lot of times a network is involved. But that's what a computer investigation is. Usually aided by some kind of technology and a network service. Computer investigation usually split into 2 types, depending on the environment and the nature of the cybercrime, or nature of the crime. I shouldn't say cybercrime. So the first one is corporate investigation, which is more focused towards a organization. So, for example, Microsoft. Any type of investigation that's carried out within Microsoft as a result of, let's say, an employee, I don't know, breaching company policy, for example, if they send out confidential information to their personal email, then that investigation would be dictated by the digital investigation procedure that Microsoft has defined within their company. They would likely have their own internal teams, incident response and forensic teams, who would be carrying out the investigation. And Microsoft themselves would have a very tight hold on what information gets out, whether this information is communicated to their customers, and obviously data impact assessment and the risk assessment and everything would be contained within that organization. So that's corporate investigation. There's no, well, there could be law enforcement involved, but that is dependent on whether the corporation wants to bring law enforcement into the situation. If they have procedures in place to deal with these kinds of breaches, which does not involve law enforcement, then they likely won't, because as everybody knows, bringing law enforcement into the conversation makes things a little more complicated. So organizations try to avoid that, but larger organizations like Microsoft, Google, they may or may not, depending on the severity of the crime. And then the second part is cybercrime investigation, which is the more common types of investigation that you would normally hear, where it's law enforcement of each country that are setting up an investigation team who are investigating a cybercrime that is happening or has happened and has been reported. So they would follow procedures set out by that law enforcement department. A lot of the times, all of this is very, very transparent because it is a government body. So a lot of the times, this information is publicly available. But when I say publicly available, it's the procedures, not the actual investigation itself. And that's the, I guess, similarity between those two types of investigations. Any ongoing investigation, information will not be released to the public, sometimes ever. Sometimes a state may or a government may decide that a case is old enough or a case has been solved, and they have no problem releasing that information, and they sometimes do give out information to the public. But a lot of the times, cases usually don't remain or stay confidential because of the nature of the data involved, maybe the personnel involved. It could be varying factors. So that's one common thing where these two types of investigations have in common. For cybercrime, for cybercrime investigation, the main difference would be none of the target systems are owned by the government unless it's an actual government system that's being investigated. They don't have any rights to that system, so they would obviously need a search and seizure warrant, before they could even go to the location where the target system is. They would need to get appropriate approvals from the district attorney, get proper sign-off and legal documents taken care of before they do any type of investigation. So that is one main point that needs to be kept in mind. I'm not going to cover cybercrime in detail. I looked at the schedule, saw that Mr. Harish had covered cybercrime as part of yesterday's session, I believe session 2. So I'm not going to cover that too much in depth. So with that, I will move on to the next one. Let's see. Okay, let's go with this one. Just need to see how much time we have. Okay, no problem. Okay, right. Core objectives of any computer investigation. So I've split it out into 6 points. This is not an extensive list. This is just a high-level description. And I've kind of covered them, again, at a high level, but we get more in depth when we come to this slide. So for the time being, let's just take a look at this. Computer investigation core objectives. Your first objective, even before you start any kind of investigation, would be to address your prerequisites. So stuff that you would need to do before you start an investigation. What kind of software and hardware would you need to actually carry out an investigation? Do you need write blockers? Do you need hard drives for making copies? Your logbook, your notepad, your Faraday bag, your forensic workstation. Do you need pens? Do you need paper? And yes, even something as simple as pen and paper, you will need to have ready, because anything that you see will need to be recorded, because sometimes I mentioned this towards the beginning of the presentation, but in shows they show as if the evidence is gathered in the morning, they process it in the afternoon, and by evening they found out who the criminal was, they catch the criminal before the end of the day. But that's just not realistic. Sometimes it might be, but it's very rare that a evidence is processed and the criminal is caught that fast. Sometimes it could take years before somebody's caught. So writing something down, especially in a pen, something that's permanent and not a pencil, it would help your investigation several years down the line, because you may not remember what you saw or wrote down that day a few years ago. I don't remember what I did yesterday, to be honest with you. So that would really help your investigation if it does last a long time. And obviously, all of this is defined by your, or not defined, all of this should be defined to meet the requirement that covers a wide range of technology. So we discussed this previously. Can't just be disks, can't just be mobile. It has to cover networks, it has to cover malware, it has to cover databases. Again, even though databases would still fall under your storage media, you would still need to know the different types of databases, and you'd need to know if certain databases need specific equipment in order to successfully capture that data. So you'd need to take all of that into consideration and have an overall kit, investigation kit prepared and ready to go, because at times like this, scenarios like this, first response and immediate response is crucial, because for a malware attack, it could propagate through the network immediately. Like, it could take half an hour and your entire network could be compromised. You'd need to be able to go immediately as soon as you get the notification. But if you spend your time setting things up after you get the notification, it could already be too late. So have everything ready would be the first one. So the prerequisite, I guess. Second one is have a systematic approach. Define your methodology. So have a service definition or standard operation procedure. So the reason I say this is because your team could have 10 people, it could have 100 people. But if every single person there knows exactly what step to follow at what point in the investigation, anybody could handle the evidence and could do the investigation, and you would still arrive at the same result. And obviously, any external factor coming in, they can easily be identified as deviations to the methodology. So having a defined, well-defined approach, a methodology, would help, well, present the case better. Because if you say you followed one approach and if your colleague says they followed another approach, the judge and the jury are not going to be convinced. It's not really comforting to hear two people from the same team doing two different things. And arriving at the same result is one thing, but also getting different results is not really a good thing to have either. So there's that. Obviously, if it helps, have it on paper, like print it out, have it with you. Keep it as part of your toolkit, your investigation toolkit. Third one, know the procedures for corporate and cybercrime investigations. This obviously depends on the type of investigation that's being carried out. If you're part of a corporate team, chances are you already know what the procedure is. You probably have it thoroughly, memorized, and you would need to know which teams to contact, whether there's any legal team that needs to be pulled into this before you start the investigation and stuff like that. But for cybercrime, like I mentioned before, you would possibly need to get a search warrant, get a seizure warrant. You'd need to talk to the district attorney, get their sign off. You'd need to try and see if there's if it's in a different jurisdiction, you'd need to talk to that jurisdiction's law enforcement. Make sure you have proper sign off from them, because even if you have probable cause, you cannot just start investigating, or not just investigating, start acquiring data from a foreign data source, or a foreign national's data source from their own country. it would cause problems. So you'd need to make sure you know your proper procedure. You need to know who your point of contacts are. And like I said before, like within organizations, if as long as the device is owned by that organization, they wouldn't need any kind of search and seizure warrant. They wouldn't need to talk to like district attorneys because it's their device. They wouldn't need permission to check their own device. So those will need to be kept in mind as well. And then once you've cleared all that, you'll also need to know what kind of requirements there are for data recovery workstations. Initially, I briefly touched on a point on a hardware forensic tool called a write blocker. Basically, it again, I'll go through this in this slide, but you need to know what type of hardware and software tools you would need per the system that's being looked at. So if you're looking at a specific server, then you'd need to know for a Windows server, you'd need to know what kind of tools, both hardware and software you'd need. But if you're looking at a Linux server, be it Ubuntu or Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you'd need to know what kind of requirements there are for that. So you need to take, when you're building your toolkit, obviously you'll need to take these kinds of things into consideration as well. But specifically for data recovery, which is one of the most crucial parts of forensic investigation lifecycle, you need to take into consideration these aspects. And if you look at the third point, I've called out that ensure write blockers are used wherever necessary, and workstation used to image the evidence is clean. So the first part I'll cover in the later slides. But the second part of that point is very important. So obviously you have your workstation, your forensic workstation, but you need to make sure that that workstation is updated. You can't have critical vulnerabilities or security gaps on the workstation that you're going to be investigating a security crime for. You also need to make sure that it's clean of any previous forensic evidence that you worked on. So any previous case that you worked on, any leftover files that can't be there, you have to put that onto a disk. You have to keep that in a secure location. Make sure your system is clean, both in terms of past data, but also in terms of malwares and security risks, free of security risks. You also have to consider the fact that if you start working away on again, data forensics, you may accidentally come across information from your past case, which isn't really good. And this especially applies if you're using a quote unquote used hard disk to create a new image on. So if you clone a hard disk onto a pre-used hard disk, you run the risk of having partial data from some old case which has no relation to this, in which case, again, not admissible data, the case will be thrown out of court because that data has been tampered with. So just a few things to keep in mind. Make sure everything's clean. Do your checks, take your time, but just make sure that the evidence that you're gathering at the end of the day is clean and unaffected by whatever you're doing. Obviously, the next point would be conduct the investigation. Make sure you follow the predefined investigation runbook, which is the methodology that I mentioned earlier. If there's any deviation at all, make sure you write it down, and that log will have to be submitted as evidence as well, because if you're making changes to your runbook, then you'll need to explain why you've changed it, because I would assume that was induced by an external influence. So maybe something happened to the device, maybe somebody else came in, the scene was contaminated, whatever the reason may be. If you had to deviate from your standard process, then make a note of it. Make sure not only to make sure that the criminal system or the justice system is aware of it, but also to clear your name, because you're doing all of this as a professional, as an investigator, as a digital investigator. So if you do something that is wrong, and if you don't log it, and if you get caught, you will never be allowed to work as an investigator again, which is a big risk to take. So it's good to have that in place. And follow the ACCA guidelines. This is really good. I have another slide right after this. I will take you through that. Even though this is defined in the UK and Ireland, it can still be followed worldwide because the whole aim is to make sure that the data is treated with utmost care. Follow appropriate chain of custody and ensure that is reflected in the chain of custody log. Chain of custody is basically who is in charge, who should be handling the data. If a person is handling the data, do they have the proper permission to do so? So chain of command would always, the chain of command would always be supervisor first, secondary, and then whatever role that the primary assigns to their investigators. So at the end of the day, if a decision needs to be made, it has to be made by the primary or the person in charge. And obviously, chain of custody follows that same thing as well. But to be more specific, chain of custody is let's say you let's say you as an investigator have a piece of evidence that you have labeled, you have recorded, and you've sealed in a bag. In the chain of custody log, you have to write your name, the date and time that you bagged that evidence, and then that's now in your possession. If you hand that to somebody else, let's say you hand that over to your colleague who's in the same role as you, but is going to take that bag to the forensic lab, they will need to sign their name and the date and time they took the evidence from you, and only after that's done will they be able to take over the evidence and take that to the actual lab. If that isn't completed, then you should not be giving that evidence to the other person. So chain of custody log is that. Basically, every single person who handles the evidence will need to record that so that when you do ultimately take that to court, the court knows exactly who had access to this evidence, when, and why. And so that's one of the main points. Complete and critique a case. Review the results with no bias to provide an accurate critique. Sometimes people, like obviously humans are open to bias depending on information that you receive. You may have heard, oh, this is definitely a bad guy. And even though there's no real evidence to support that, in your mind, you would start thinking, oh, this person told me this person's a bad guy, so there's definitely bad evidence here. Which is not really helpful for any investigation that's being carried out, because you will look for very specific information that could be used to implicate this person, but you could be missing out on something that's very obvious, but because of your bias, you're not looking at it objectively. If an investigator is not able to identify any valuable information, getting the view of a qualified and authorized personnel might do the trick. This is similar to writer's block that I'm sure a lot of people are aware of. If you're not able to see some useful information, you could leave the case be for a week, assuming you have that time, and come back to it. You might see it from a new perspective. You might be able to get an outside, not an outside, but a different view. So your colleague or your supervisor, you might be able to get their view and see if they can identify something that you have missed that might also do the trick. And finally, I mentioned this towards the beginning, an investigator does not determine if the person is guilty or not, but merely presents facts to the court. That is all an investigator's job is. You get the data, you handle it properly, you analyze the information, and you present facts. That's basically it. What happens after that is up to the judge to decide, because they are the legal body who are, I guess, well, qualified to judge if a person is guilty or not based on the evidence. Where an additional role an investigator might need to fulfill is acting as an expert witness, where if you've presented information to the court, and if the defendant comes back saying, no, I don't believe that this data is valid and it's been tampered, then you would need to go on stage or on stand, put your reputation on the line as an expert witness, tell them exactly how you handle the data, show them all the evidence that you can, and tell them how you identified this specific evidence and how you think, or not how you think, how it is this specific data was identified and recorded, and if there's any supplementary information, provide that as well. Basically, provide all the facts as is, provide as much information as you can, because the whole point of the defense is to show that you are not right or you don't know what you're doing. They don't even need to prove that you're wrong. If they can prove that you don't know what you're doing, then that's all the information the judge would need to say, well, if you don't know what you're doing, then this evidence is useless. In which case, again, repeat, which is that case gets thrown out. So bit of a detail-oriented role when it comes to digital investigation and forensics. And again, the final topic, which I hopefully have enough time for, probably, processing crime and incident scenes. The ACCA Guidelines, aka the Bible. And again, this was built in the UK and Ireland, but the principles are solid enough that it could be followed worldwide. The basis is make sure the data is secure and it's unaltered. Principle number 1, no action taken by law enforcement agencies, persons employed within those agencies or their agents should change data which may subsequently be relied upon court. Essentially, you should not do anything that would alter the data. Again, this goes back to the 2 main points that I brought up earlier. Second one, in circumstances where a person finds it necessary to access original data, the person must be competent to do so and be able to give evidence explaining the relevance and the implications of their actions. So core requirement is you have to know what you're doing. You cannot just randomly handle the data and be expected to be given a okay. You have to be qualified. You also have to show exactly why you had to change or access the original data to whoever is asking you this information, because whatever action that you take will change the original data, which is the original data is basically the original copy that we take of the image or of the hard disk. Principle 3, an audit trail or other record of all processes applied to digital evidence should be created and preserved. An independent third party should be able to examine those processes and achieve the same result. So this combined with principle 2, this will be combined with principle 2. So basically, any changes that you do, like I mentioned, you have to record everything. The reason you have to record everything is because it should be repeatable. It's like science, where think of it as a science practical almost. If you have everything recorded in detail, somebody else who has no knowledge of this investigation should be able to follow those exact steps and reach the exact same result. If they receive different results after following the exact steps, then either you did not do what you said you did, or you did not record the logs properly, in which case, again, same situation, your evidence is invalid. Principle 4, the person in charge of the investigation has overall responsibility for ensuring that the law and principles are adhered to. So, same thing, chain of command, primary or the supervisor is in charge. If something goes wrong, they will be questioned. And it's their responsibility to make sure that no law is broken and that the 4 principles are adhered to. So again, it's not specific to any jurisdiction. It's just principles that have to be abided to make sure that the data is secure. It's a good guideline, obviously. It's referred to as the Bible here, so take that as you will. Right, we're getting to the last stretch. Hopefully I'll be able to wrap this up fairly quickly, and then after that, if you have any questions, do let me know. Key steps in forensic investigation. There are 14 key steps. I've broken them down here. Hopefully it's big enough that everybody can get a good idea. But it goes left, right, left, right, left. Just to make sure nobody's confused. But starting off from the first, identify the computer crime. Again, I'm going to be skipping between these 2 slides. So just a quick heads up on that one. Identifying the computer crime. how would you know that a computer crime has been committed? If you're the person whose system is being affected, then obviously you would know that way. But that would also mean that you would have to be the investigator. That may not necessarily be the case all the time. So somebody else within your organization has reported a crime. So your team is notified of the potential crime. Uh, so when you're being notified, gain as much preliminary information on the nature of the crime itself. Um, ask the person whether there was any message displayed on the screen. Ask them if anything flashed on the screen, if a command line prompt came up, if the system was shut down, what did they do with the system, have they unplugged it from the network, all those kinds of things. Get as much information as possible when you're notified. So you have identified the computer crime, and then you have also collected preliminary evidence. And the next one is, collect preliminary evidence is just have enough data about the actual crime itself. It could be a breach, it could be a malware, it could be data disclosure, or maybe it's a ransomware attack. Whatever it is, you have that preliminary information in hand, and you obviously, if possible, identify which system it is. So they might be able to give you the system name, the system's IP, the MAC address, stuff like that. And then the third step would be to obtain court warrant for a seizure if required. And this is specific to cybercrime, where it's more law enforcement rather than corporate investigation. If it's not a device that you have legal authority over, then you would need to get a search and seizure warrant from the court or from the district attorney before you can actually go to the site and start gathering data for investigation. So that's specific for cybercrime by law enforcement, not necessarily for corporate. But again, even for corporate, it might be required if, let's say, confidential information was sent to a person's personal computer, which is at their home address. The company obviously wouldn't have any control over that person's home technology. So in that case, they may need to go to the court, or if there's a legal team internally, if they have procedures for that, they may need to consult with them, find out what they need to do, and then proceed based off of that. And then after that is perform first responder procedures. And before I move on to this, I just want to cover some of the prerequisites as well. Again, I kind of touched on this during one of our previous slides, but have your workstation and data recovery lab prepared. Have your kit ready. You can't be fumbling around when an active incident is going on. You need to be ready to go at any time. So have your workstation and your lab prepared. Contact the relevant parties. So if you're inside a corporation or an organization, contact your legal team, tell them that this is something that's come up and you're not sure what the exact nature of the incident is, but you're going to find out more. Contact the IT admins, network engineers, AD admins, domain admins, all the good stuff. Whoever you need to gain more information and access to the systems in scope, reach out to all of them. It doesn't have to be the primary or the supervisor. It could be somebody that the primary has assigned a role to as the what is it called, the liaison, basically the person who talks to everybody else within the organization. And obviously, in terms of cybercrime, this would be a media spokesperson, where they control the information that's being left out or let out of the investigation. And obviously, they're also going to be responsible for talking to other parties. Like if there's other companies that are involved, then they would reach out to those companies, talk to them, tell them what the situation is, make sure it's all confidential, bring in lawyers, all that good stuff. So make sure that's done while the actual investigation team is getting ready to go begin the investigation. Within the investigation team itself, the supervisor would be predefined because that would usually be the lead of the team. They would need to define the roles. And this, again, it would likely be defined as part of the methodology itself. But if there's a couple of different people, then it might change based on the case and based on their specialty. It would also you'd also need to make sure that your chain of custody is defined, because it could be that only specific people are allowed to handle the evidence. So that needs to be defined within the investigation team itself. Obviously, there's roles like primary, secondary, photographer, evidence collector. There could be multiple evidence collectors. There could be one or two photographers. So depending on the number of personnel you have, depending on the size of the incident, you'd need to define all of this before you head out, because once you go on site, there's no time. And then finally, agreed scope. So once you've talked to the relevant teams, once you've talked to the legal entities and all of them, you need to find out which systems are okay to, I guess, investigate, which systems are off limits. Now, this is kind of a niche criteria, but the reason I've brought that up here is because there have been certain instances where a company might say, no, this specific server contains business sensitive information. So if this information gets out, we would face millions of euros in loss, or we would face severe regulatory fines, stuff like that. In that case, we would need to know what systems are okay to access and which systems are off limits. If at any point at all you feel like there's any of these off limit systems might have evidence, then obviously talk to the relevant teams, talk to legal, tell them that this is something that you might think will need to be accessed, and then based off of that, make sure you cover all your bases before you start accessing that system. Basically, sign off on everything before you do anything. And then your first responder procedures, right? When you, as an investigator, go to a crime scene, the first thing that you need to do is quarantine. And when I say quarantine, I mean cordon off the site. So let's say if this is a server room, which is, I don't know, 10 by 10 meters, let's say, for example, and there are two servers inside the server room. There's one person already inside the server room. They're the person who called you. Number one, make sure, you've seen the whole yellow tape that people use to block off access to any site, an investigation site. So do that. That is an actual thing that people do, even in digital investigation. Anybody who's already in the site cannot leave the site until they are thoroughly examined and are cleared by the investigation team. Anybody who is outside cannot enter the site, no matter how important they say they are, except for the investigation team. Nobody else can enter the site until the investigation team gives the go-ahead. The crime scene, so quarantining the site would essentially make sure that the crime scene remains undisturbed by outside influence, which means whatever you saw the scene as when you entered is what it will be when you start your investigation. Nobody can just come in, start moving things around, and potentially tamper evidence. Because if somebody has a USB drive, for example, plugged to the server, they may want to grab it and run. But if they're not allowed inside the actual location, they can't do that. So it just helps keep the investigation site clean. Yeah, again, to repeat, only the investigation team has access to the scene and the evidence. Anyone who has the scene of the crime, anti-admins, tech support, etc., will remain at the scene until appropriately checked and cleared by the investigation team. So that's the first one. The second first response procedure would be label and photograph everything. Actually, sorry, one more thing that I kind of forgot to mention. So before you allow anybody to leave the site, interview them, ask them questions, ask them as much questions as you could possibly can. Even if you've asked the question to them before, make sure you ask them again, because you never know. Maybe they might give you a different answer. Maybe they might remember something that they didn't previously. It's always good to double check. It's okay to be redundant as long as you're thorough. It's fine. So get testaments from anybody who's on site and any witnesses potentially. Even if there's somebody who was standing maybe close by to that room, talk to them, see if you can get some information from them, see if they saw anything unusual. Any information that you can get is helpful to your investigation. Next one is label and photograph everything. After the quarantine's established, the first thing that needs to be done is, even before you talk to anybody, you talk to any witnesses, get testaments and all that, is take a photograph. Just make sure that you have a picture of the um, initial state of the crime scene. So if a chair is in one position, then that photograph would tell you that that chair was in that position when people entered, but then it has been moved to another location at the end of the investigation. If a USB drive was in the first photo, but if it's not in the second photo, and if it's not been logged in the evidence, then that means somebody else took that USB, or somebody has actually evidenced that USB, but they haven't labeled it properly, which means, again, improper handling of evidence can't be used as actual evidence in court, which means the case gets thrown out. Or not thrown out, but that piece of information won't be usable, which could have a massive impact on the overall ruling of the case. Yeah, as a rule, no object must be moved until it is labeled and photographed in its initial state. So an example that I can give is, we had to do a workshop for corporate investigation at my master's, and the workshop, the scenario was, a person had been doing inside trading, and he has been stealing, classified information. Go to his office, do a full forensic examination, and see what you can find. And essentially, there we were split into primary, secondary, photographer, evidence collector, and every single piece of item that was on that room, even before we moved it, we had to take photograph of it. We had to label it. So if you've seen crime shows, you know how they have these little yellow paper triangle things where they keep the numbers. So it says label number 1, take a photograph of that. Label number 2, take a photograph of that. And then only can you open up a book or lift up the keyboard, stuff like that. And in cases like this, it's very helpful, because one of the evidences was like under the chair, it was taped under the chair, but we had to flip over the chair for that. But obviously, we had to give an explanation to why the chair was flipped. Even though it seems simple, it actually contributed to us building a proper narrative around the actual task that we did to identify this evidence where it was. So it's good to make sure that you don't move anything until you've labeled it, taken a photograph. If there's nothing there, that's fine. At least you did your due diligence. And if there's no evidence, that's great. If there is evidence, at least you have that recorded. The quarantine area is the investigation team's domain. If there's a suspicion of any potential evidence being stored in any unlikely location, the investigators must ensure that the location is appropriately labeled, photographed, before proceeding to investigate the location in question. It's what I mentioned before. If you think there's something in a specific location, just take a photograph, take a look at the location. If there's nothing there, that's fine. You've done your due diligence. If there is something there, at least you know. At least you've taken a photograph of the before, before status, before you started rummaging through certain things. The primary is the lead for any investigation. If there is any specific direction provided to the team by the primary, this must be followed. Any exception to do so will need to be recorded in the form of logs. Again, kind of same point that I covered here. Where is this? Yeah, the primary secondary thing, the chain of command and chain of custody thing. Listen to the primary. If they say something, even if it's wrong, just do it. If somebody asks you why you did this, you can just say you follow the chain of command, and that's basically it. Logging. I'd mentioned this during the network forensics side as well, but logs are very helpful, especially here. Some investigators use voice memos or audio logs. Some investigators use video logs. Basically, set up a camera in the corner, make sure they record everything that they do, so that they could watch it later or listen to it later, get a full idea of exactly every single thing that happened in that room or that location. Others tend to stick with like actual handwritten logs, so have a notepad, write everything down. If they're the if they're the lead, they usually have a person to actually take the logs so that they're not missing anything. So that is also one of the roles that is assigned to a investigator. Again, one more minor point, but it is, I guess, it does help in an investigation. If you are opting for a written log, then opt for a pen instead of pencil. It is more, well, yeah, it's longer lasting. I won't say it's permanent because obviously it depends on the actual paper that you write on, but at least if the paper survives, then you would be able to see the actual writing on the note. Finally, evidence gathering and transport. This is one of the first points that was taught to us when we started doing forensics is never turn off any device. And when I say that, I mean, don't go through the standard, oh, click the start menu, click on power off, click on shutdown, and then wait for the system to shut down. Because if you do that, that means one, you're providing inputs to the system, which means the data is constantly being changed or updated. But also, that also means the system will start clearing out the memory. And once it shuts down, the memory is wiped. But if you just pull the plug, then the memory stays there for a while, and it's usually cleared after when the next time the system boots up. So that gives you a chance to do a quick memory dump of whatever is in the memory, or just get a frozen point in time of the hard disk. So for a server, if you need the server to stop immediately, just pull the plug. It's okay. Don't worry about who's going to say what. If you think there is plausible reason for shutting down the system immediately, just pull the plug. It's standard procedure when it comes to a lot of forensic investigation. It likely is defined in a lot of the run books, so not really that big of a problem. Out of the digital crime scene, what you may see may not always be what is actually there. In addition to the physical evidence that is available, investigators must be able to identify supporting systems that interacted with the affected machine. So again, system and network logs should be secured with timestamp verified by the IT team. And again, this kind of acts as supplementary information or complementary information, where if you have logs in place and if the events of the log matches up with the logs of the system, then obviously that furthers your case. NTP servers, which are also time servers, being used is also a good way to verify if the timelines of events in the affected system matches the timestamps from the logs. NTP servers are usually used by organizations to basically sync time. So that basically means every single system in that organization will have the exact same time. There will be no chance of one system saying it's 10 o'clock, the other system saying it's 10:05, the other system saying it's 11. There's no chance of that at all. So syncing all servers to an NTP server, a central NTP server, is a good way to make sure that your logs all match up. Next one, be thorough, make sure every nook and cranny is covered. We've kind of covered this in the previous points as well, but again, make sure you cover everything, because once you vacate the site, good chance by the time you come back, if you realize something, that site may have been cleaned, it may have been visited by the person by the criminal, they may have taken any additional evidence that you may have missed. So during your initial sweep, be thorough, make sure you cover everything. The forensic lab where you actually do your analysis may not necessarily be the same location as a crime scene. So even if you're in an organization, you may not necessarily be in the same building as where your crime scene is. So you need to transport the evidence to your actual forensic lab to start the analysis process. So keep in mind that there are certain safety procedures that need to be covered when you're transporting the evidence. So before transporting evidence, ensure that all evidence is labeled accurately with time, description, and identifiers unique to that specific case. So evidence bags are basically your life send. They will save you in most situations, at least when it comes to evidencing. Usually time and description. Description is just a short description of what it is. I don't know, a USB, mobile phone, operating system, mobile phone, Apple, keyboard, mouse, what have you, and then identify it unique to that specific case. Usually cases are given a case identifier. It could be anything, but it has to be unique to that case. So for example, if your previous case was ABC123, your next case should be ABC124. And then any evidence collected under ABC124 should be labeled as ABC124-01, ABC124-02, and so on, so that you know when you see that identifier, you know exactly what case you're talking about. So this also makes sure that when you collect and gather evidence, you don't accidentally store it in some other place where it doesn't belong. If it does accidentally get misplaced, again, you can look at the identifier, you know exactly which case this specific piece of evidence belongs to. Evidence must be handled per the evidence handling guideline defined by the investigation procedure. Again, leads back into the methodology that I described earlier. It's again, if it helps, just have a printout. I'm sure it works, but that's that. Any change to the evidence, including potential device failures or accidents, must be thoroughly documented along with statements from any witnesses if available. Same thing. If you remember the ACCA principles, principle 2. In circumstances where a person finds it necessary to access original data, the person must be competent to do so and be able to give the evidence explaining relevance and implication of their actions. And principle 3, which is basically an audit trail. So that combined forms this last statement. So if you're changing any of the original data, you have to make sure that it's documented and you have a very valid reason for why you had to do what you had to do. If it's something like, oh, I did not know, that's not a valid reason. It has to be that I had to do this to get this specific result that was crucial for this investigation. Then yes, that is a valid rationale. You have all the logs in there to actually justify your action. That's fine, but it has to be valid. It can't be I wasn't aware of it, or I didn't know it was an accident type of situation. And for my presentation, at least, preservation, which is the very last step in this journey. So obviously I'll be covering these 3 modules, or these 3 specific topics. So generate MD5 checksum, create 2-bit stream copies, and then store original. Wait, what am I doing? Sorry. Create 2-bit stream copies, generate MD5 checksum, maintain chain of custody, and store the original evidence in a secure location. Okay, so preservation, right? This is easily the step in any forensic investigation that could make or break an investigation. The reason I say that is because one of the main activities, which I'm sure you would have covered yesterday, is forensic imaging, which is basically taking an exact like-for-like image, a copy of your original hard disk or compact disk, floppy, whichever data you have, taking an exact like-for-like copy, a bit-for-bit copy, and then making a clone of that machine, of that hard disk. We usually do this through a process called a bit-to-bit or 2-bit stream image, 2-bit stream imaging. The reason is because when you, so to go to the core of this, when you copy a file in Windows or Mac or Linux, when you hit Control-C to copy a file, an actual copy of that image is cached. Think of it as an invisible copy that is being made of the original file. And then that is slowly transferred to your target disk. So in this image, there's the original disk. This is copied. This is the quote-unquote invisible disk. And then you actually copy the contents over here. It's not just this is being replicated in real time over here. This creates a copy. This copy is slowly transferred to the destination. This is how the file system handles data copying and data retrieval. Obviously, we can't have this disk creating copies internally because that would mean we're changing the file system. So we can't allow it to copy onto itself. So we have two disks. One is where the shadow copy is copied over, and then from there, we allow it to copy onto the actual target disk itself. I can't remember why we can't do it directly. I think we definitely need this buffer. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind. But once you do a 2-bit stream copy, you essentially have a exact like-for-like image of your original disk. So any data that's stored, any garbage data that is marked for deletion, that is on the disk, any unstructured data, any gaps, any free space, any information at all on the original disk, it will be exactly replicated on the copy disk. And now that you have your original disk, oh, sorry, what am I doing? What am I doing? Sorry, now that you've done that, your original disk will essentially not be touched because that still has to remain on the server itself. But you now have a target disk, which is your original copy, if you will. So that disk can be replicated n number of times, but this disk cannot be altered at all. So what you do is you create an MD5 hash for this disk, you get the value, and then create an MD5 hash for the new clone that you created for the same image, get that value, compare them. They should match because you haven't changed any data from here. This would now be your original disk. They should match. If they don't match, then obviously something's gone wrong. You have to create a new copy again. Once the values match, your original copy. Now remember, we have kept this back on the server or the system that we're investigating. This is now considered your original copy. So your unaltered copy will need to be locked in a safe location. Obviously, it will need to be handled per the evidence guide. You need to mark it as evidence, call that it's the quote unquote original copy. Put that in a safe location and only retrieve it when you need to take it to court for evidencing. Any analysis that you do, it'll have to be done on copies of this target disk or copies of this original disk, because you can't change any of the contents from the clone that you create. Any other copy that you've made off of this disk, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want with it. But as long as the disk copy is safe, you should be okay. So that is preservation. The reason it's called preservation is because whatever data is here is the original data. As long as you preserve this and the integrity of this specific hard disk, you can essentially show the court that whatever evidence that you've gathered can be gathered from this disk as well. So it shows that even though you change the contents of the clones, you would still be able to analyze and then gather the exact same data from the original disk if the court wanted you to. It's just to, again, further your case and show that whatever evidence that you've gathered and presented is valid and it's not fabricated. But that's basically the concept of preservation when it comes to digital forensics. There are a few more steps. So I've covered up until here. But there's going to be analyze the image copy for evidence, prepare a forensic report, submit report to client and or court, and if required, testify as an expert witness. But all of these, as I understand, will be covered at upcoming modules. So for me, I believe that is all. Is there any question anybody wants to raise?
If you have any query, you can unmute your mic and you can ask your query, or you can message through chat box. Sriram, I think there's no query. If any clarification or queries, I'll ask them to mail you directly.
Yeah. Okay, that's perfect.
So thank you very much, Sriram, because I know your time is midnight. I think now around 6:30 a.m. I suppose.
Yeah, it is.
You have spent your time in the almost you have missed your sleeping time the last night.
No, that's fine, sir. I'm actually really grateful that you reached out to me because obviously this is a this is something that I've done in the past, and obviously for HI engineering, I don't mind talking and giving these kinds of lectures and speeches because the more people who are exposed to cybersecurity and cyber forensics, the better it is. Because India, even though it's such a large country, there's not a lot of people who do security, which is unfortunate. But it's always a good thing when I can deliver these kinds of presentations and speeches where more people are exposed to security concepts. And obviously, I I saw the resource personnel for the upcoming sessions and the sessions that's already given, and there's a lot of like big names, and I'm actually really honored to actually be a part of this cyber forensics module. So I really appreciate you reaching out to me, sir. And obviously, I think it's I don't even need to say it, but if you need me to do any kind of similar session in the future, I'm always happy to do so.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sriram. On behalf of the Center for Faculty Development, Anna University and GI Engineering College, and all the participants, I thank you once again. We'll meet you sometime later. So thank you. Thank you all. The participants, you can join again at 1:25. So afternoon we have two sessions. One from Mr. Shaktivel. He is also alumni of University of Dublin, and we have a second session. Our IPS officer, Dr. Murugan, is handling the second session. So I request everyone to join in time and enjoy the session. So thank you very much. We will have a lunch break, and we will meet again by 1:25. Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, sir.